Imagine waking up one morning to find that everything you knew, everything that held your world together, had simply vanished. The roads that connected cities are crumbling. The schools are closing. The libraries are burning. The government that once protected you has collapsed. This isn't some post-apocalyptic fantasy. This was reality for millions of people living in Europe between the 5th and 10th centuries, a period we've come to know by a name that sends shivers down the spine of history itself: the Dark Ages. But here's the sinister truth they don't tell you in textbooks. The Dark Ages weren't just dark because knowledge was lost. They weren't just dark because civilizations fell. They were dark because of what replaced them, because of the deliberate choices made by those in power, and because of secrets that have been buried for over 1,000 years. Today, we're going to excavate those secrets, and what we find might completely change how you see the foundation of modern Europe. The year is 476 CE. The Roman Empire, the greatest superpower the Western world had ever seen, is taking its final breath. For over 1,000 years, Rome had been the beating heart of Western civilization. Its roads connected 3 continents. Its laws governed millions. Its culture, philosophy, and engineering were the envy of the known world. Roman aqueducts brought fresh water to cities. Roman libraries housed the accumulated knowledge of centuries. Roman schools educated the elite in philosophy, mathematics, rhetoric, and science. And then, in a moment that would echo through the centuries, it all came crashing down. The last Western Roman emperor, a boy with the ironic name of Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. The imperial purple, the symbol of Roman authority, was sent to Constantinople in the east. The west was left to the wolves. But this wasn't a sudden apocalypse. Rome had been dying for decades, bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Barbarian invasions, economic collapse, political corruption, plague, and civil war had been eating away at the empire's foundations like termites in a grand palace. What followed wasn't just a political transition. It was a civilizational collapse on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the 20th century. Imagine you're a Roman citizen living in a provincial city in Gaul in the year 450. Your father was a merchant. Your grandfather was a minor government official. You grew up in a world of order and predictability. You attended school. You learned to read and write in Latin. You studied rhetoric and basic mathematics. You expected to follow in your family's footsteps, perhaps becoming a tax collector or a magistrate. Then everything falls apart. The imperial government stops sending soldiers to protect the frontier. Tax collectors stop coming. The coins your family saved become worthless because no one trusts them anymore. Germanic tribes cross the Rhine and settle on lands that were Roman for 400 years. The local governor tries to maintain order, but he has no army, no money, no authority from Rome because Rome is gone. Within 20 years, your city has changed beyond recognition. The public baths are closed because no one maintains the aqueduct. The forum where citizens once debated politics is empty because there's no government to petition. The schools are closed because there's no money to pay teachers. The stone buildings are being slowly dismantled by locals who need building materials. Your neighbors, educated Romans who once quoted Virgil and Cicero, can't read anymore. Their children certainly can't. You're lucky if you're still alive. Plague has swept through twice. Famine came when the grain shipments from Africa stopped. Raiders attacked 3 times, taking everything of value. You've watched your civilized world transform into something brutal and primitive, and there's nothing you can do about it. That was the reality of the transition from Roman civilization to the Dark Ages. It wasn't abstract. It was personal, traumatic, and devastating for millions of people. Within a generation, the infrastructure that had taken centuries to build began to fail. The famous Roman roads, once the arteries of an empire, fell into disrepair. Without a central government to maintain them, they cracked and crumbled. Trade routes that had connected Britain to North Africa, Spain to Syria, ground to a halt. Cities that had housed hundreds of thousands shrank to mere villages. Rome itself, once home to over 1 million people, saw its population plummet to perhaps 30,000 souls huddling among the ruins of their ancestors' glory. The economy collapsed. The sophisticated Roman monetary system broke down. Coins disappeared from circulation. Society reverted to barter. Specialization, the hallmark of advanced civilization, became a luxury no one could afford. Why be a skilled craftsman when you might starve? Better to grow your own food, even if you did it poorly. But the most devastating loss wasn't economic or political. It was intellectual. The Roman world had been remarkably literate. Not everyone could read, certainly, but literacy was common enough that street graffiti, public notices, and personal letters were everyday parts of life. The empire had maintained public libraries, schools, and scriptoria where books were copied and preserved. Classical knowledge, Greek philosophy, Roman law, mathematical treatises, medical texts, poetry, history, all of it was available to those who sought it. And then, almost overnight in historical terms, that light went out. Literacy rates plummeted. Some estimates suggest that by the year 600, less than 1% of the population in Western Europe could read. And we're not talking about peasants here. Kings, nobles, warriors, the people who now ruled this shattered world, many of them were illiterate. They signed their decrees with an X. They couldn't read the laws they supposedly enforced. The great libraries, burned, abandoned, or left to rot. Do you know how many intact manuscripts of classical literature survived from the ancient world? We're talking about works by Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Virgil, Cicero. The answer will shock you. In many cases, only a single copy survived the Dark Ages. A single manuscript, hidden away in some forgotten monastery, was all that stood between immortal works of genius and complete oblivion. Entire fields of knowledge simply vanished. The Romans had concrete that could set underwater and has lasted 2,000 years. That formula was lost. Greek fire, the Byzantine Empire's secret weapon, a substance that burned on water, lost. Advanced Roman surgical techniques, lost. The mathematical and astronomical works of the Greeks, nearly lost. If it hadn't been for scholars in the Islamic world preserving and translating these texts, they would have been gone forever. Think about what was actually lost. The Romans had a postal system that could deliver messages from Britain to Rome in weeks. They had a standardized system of weights and measures across 3 continents. They had central heating in their villas, using hypocaust systems that circulated hot air under floors. They had apartment buildings, insulae, that housed hundreds of families in urban centers. They had firefighting brigades. They had police forces. They had banking systems that allowed merchants to conduct business across the empire without carrying physical gold. All of this vanished. A person living in the year 900 had access to less technology, less comfort, less security, and less opportunity than their ancestor living in the year 200. That's not supposed to happen in human history. We're supposed to progress, to build on the achievements of our ancestors. Instead, Europe went backwards for half a millennium. Let me give you a specific example that illustrates just how much was lost. In the 2nd century CE, the Greek mathematician and astronomer Ptolemy wrote a treatise called the Almagest. It contained sophisticated mathematical models of planetary motion, star catalogs, and trigonometric tables. It was the pinnacle of ancient astronomical knowledge. By the year 800, there wasn't a single person in Western Europe who could understand it, even if they could find a copy, which they couldn't. The mathematics was too advanced. The concepts were too foreign. The Latin translations that had existed were lost or corrupted beyond use. It took the work of Islamic scholars translating and commenting on the text, and then European scholars rediscovering those Arabic versions centuries later, before this knowledge returned to Europe. That's the sinister truth right there. Europe didn't just lose books and buildings. It lost the ability to even comprehend what it had lost. The gap between the classical world and the medieval world wasn't just a gap in knowledge. It was a gap in cognitive capability, in the very tools of thought. But here's where the story takes a sinister turn. because it wasn't all accidental. Some of this knowledge was deliberately destroyed. Early Christian authorities viewed pagan learning with deep suspicion. Pagan temples were torn down, their libraries scattered. Philosophical schools were closed. The Academy in Athens, founded by Plato himself nearly 1,000 years earlier, was shut down in 529 by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. The pursuit of worldly knowledge came to be seen as a distraction from, or even a threat to, spiritual salvation. Now, let me be absolutely clear about something. This isn't an attack on Christianity. Religion played a crucial and often positive role during the Dark Ages. Monasteries became the sole preservers of literacy and learning. Monks painstakingly copied manuscripts, often saving texts that would otherwise have been lost forever. The church provided social services, operated hospitals, and maintained some semblance of order in a chaotic world. Christianity gave people hope and meaning in desperately difficult times. The monasteries deserve special recognition here. Places like the monastery at Monte Cassino in Italy, Lindisfarne in England, and Fulda in Germany became islands of learning in a sea of ignorance. Monks spent their lives in scriptoria, copying rooms, where they would laboriously reproduce texts by hand. It might take a monk an entire year to copy a single book. Every letter was drawn carefully with a quill pen. Every page was a work of art and devotion. These monks preserved not just Christian texts, but also pagan classics. Works by Virgil, Ovid, Cicero. They survived because some monk somewhere thought they were worth copying, even though they were written by non-Christians. We owe an immense debt to these anonymous scholars who kept the flame of knowledge alive when it could so easily have been extinguished forever. Saint Benedict of Nursia established the Benedictine rule in the 6th century, which made the copying of manuscripts and the education of novices a core monastic duty. His motto, Ora et Labora, pray and work, saved Western learning. Irish monks like Saint Columba and Saint Columbanus went even further, establishing monasteries across Europe and preserving texts in scriptoria on remote islands and in dense forests where raiders couldn't easily reach them. But we also can't ignore that there was a fundamental shift in values. The classical world had celebrated the human capacity for reason, for understanding the natural world, for political participation, for individual achievement. The medieval worldview that replaced it emphasized faith over reason, the afterlife over the present world, obedience over inquiry, and collective salvation over individual glory. The result, for the average person living in the year 700, life had gotten unimaginably worse than it had been in the year 300. Let's talk about what daily life was actually like in the Dark Ages, because the reality is far more brutal than most people imagine. If you were a peasant, which is what 90% of people were, your entire world consisted of perhaps a few square miles. You were born in a small village. You would die in that same village. You would probably never travel more than 10 miles from your birthplace in your entire life. The wider world, the great cities, the distant kingdoms, they might as well have been on another planet. Your house was a single-room hut made of wood, mud, and thatch. You shared it with your entire family and often your livestock. There was no glass in the windows, just shutters that you closed against the cold, plunging your home into darkness. There was no chimney, so smoke from your cooking fire filled the room, blackening the walls and your lungs. The floor was dirt. Your bed was straw on the ground. Your diet was monotonous and barely sufficient. Grain porridge or dark bread, some vegetables if you were lucky, rarely meat unless a festival came around. Malnutrition was endemic. Famines were regular occurrences. A bad harvest meant starvation. A good harvest meant survival until next year. Disease was everywhere and medicine was largely useless. The average life expectancy was perhaps 30 to 35 years. Infant mortality was staggering, with estimates suggesting that nearly half of all children died before age 5. If you survived childhood, you faced a lifetime of backbreaking agricultural labor. Women faced the additional danger of childbirth, which was the leading cause of death for adult women. Violence was a constant threat. Without a strong central government, law enforcement was local and often arbitrary. Blood feuds between families could last generations. Bandits roamed the roads. Raiders from the north, Vikings, could descend on coastal villages without warning, killing, enslaving, and plundering. In the south, Saracen pirates did the same from their bases in North Africa and the Mediterranean islands. Let's pause here and talk about the Vikings, because their impact on the Dark Ages was absolutely devastating. Starting in the late 8th century, Scandinavian raiders began attacking the coasts of Europe with terrifying efficiency. The raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 sent shockwaves through the Christian world. Here was a holy place, supposedly protected by God himself, violated and destroyed by pagan warriors who showed no mercy. For the next 200 years, no coastal region in Europe was safe. The Vikings had longships that could navigate both open ocean and shallow rivers. They could strike hundreds of miles inland, following river systems deep into the heart of Europe. Paris was besieged. Monasteries across Britain and Ireland were repeatedly sacked. Entire populations were carried off into slavery. The psychological impact was immense. Monks added a new prayer to their liturgy. From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us. Communities that had slowly begun to accumulate wealth and knowledge saw it all destroyed in a single afternoon of fire and blood. How do you build a library when raiders might burn it next summer? How do you establish trade when merchants might be killed and their goods stolen? How do you plan for the future when you might not survive the present? The Viking Age turned the screws even tighter on a civilization already on its knees. It pushed Europe deeper into darkness, destroyed what little remained of urban life in many regions, and reinforced the militarization of society. Safety became the only currency that mattered, and people gave up their freedom to lords who could offer them protection behind castle walls. And perhaps worst of all, for most people there was no escape. You were born a serf bound to the land. You couldn't leave without your lord's permission. You had no rights, no legal recourse, no hope of social mobility. The world was divided into three orders: those who fought, the nobles; those who prayed, the clergy; and those who worked, everyone else. You were in the third category, and that's where you would stay. This was the reality of the Dark Ages for the vast majority of people. Brutal, short, and without hope of improvement. But here's the sinister part that historians often gloss over. It didn't have to be this way. The collapse of Rome created a power vacuum, and those who filled it made choices. The Germanic kingdoms that carved up the Western Empire could have preserved Roman institutions, Roman knowledge, Roman infrastructure. Some tried. Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic king of Italy, genuinely attempted to maintain Roman civilization. He employed Roman bureaucrats, preserved Roman laws, and patronized learning. But most didn't. Most of the new rulers were warlords who valued military prowess over administrative skill. They didn't see the value in maintaining roads they didn't travel or schools they couldn't read. They didn't invest in the systems that made civilization possible. They took what they wanted and let the rest collapse. And the church, which became the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, made choices too. It chose to emphasize faith over inquiry, obedience over critical thinking, and preparation for the afterlife over improvement in this life. It accumulated vast wealth and land while peasants starved. It built magnificent cathedrals while people lived in hovels. Again, this isn't to demonize the church. It preserved what learning survived. It maintained moral standards in a violent world. It performed charitable works, but it also contributed to the intellectual stagnation that characterized the Dark Ages. The sinister truth is that the Dark Ages were dark not just because of circumstances beyond anyone's control, but because of deliberate choices made by those in power. Choices to abandon learning, choices to concentrate wealth, choices to maintain rigid social hierarchies that prevented human potential from flourishing. But now, let's shatter another myth. The Dark Ages weren't uniformly dark everywhere. While Western Europe was mired in poverty and ignorance, other parts of the world were experiencing golden ages. The Byzantine Empire in the East maintained much of Roman civilization. Constantinople was a thriving metropolis of hundreds of thousands, with paved streets, running water, a sophisticated bureaucracy, and centers of learning. Even more dramatically, the Islamic world was flourishing. While European scholars struggled to preserve scraps of ancient knowledge, scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, and Damascus were not only preserving Greek and Roman texts but advancing them. They made groundbreaking discoveries in mathematics, inventing algebra and advancing geometry. They revolutionized astronomy, chemistry, and medicine. They built magnificent libraries, including the legendary House of Wisdom in Baghdad, which dwarfed anything in contemporary Europe. The House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah, established in Baghdad in the 9th century, was everything that Europe had lost. It was a combination library, translation center, and research institution. Scholars from across the Islamic world and beyond gathered there to translate texts from Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and other languages into Arabic. They didn't just translate, they commented, they debated, they built upon what they learned. Al-Khwarizmi, working at the House of Wisdom, developed algebra as a systematic discipline. His name gives us the word algorithm. Ibn al-Haytham made revolutionary discoveries in optics that wouldn't be matched in Europe for 500 years. Al-Razi wrote medical texts that were more advanced than anything available in Europe and would be used as standard textbooks in European universities once they were finally translated centuries later. Meanwhile, in Islamic Spain, the Caliphate of Cordoba was building a civilization that made Christian Europe look primitive by comparison. Under rulers like Abd al-Rahman III in the 10th century, Cordoba became the most sophisticated city in Western Europe. While London was a town of a few thousand living in wooden huts, Cordoba was a city of perhaps 500,000 with paved streets, street lighting, running water, public baths, and over 700 mosques. Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus, was a beacon of learning and culture when most of Europe was illiterate. The Great Library of Cordoba housed hundreds of thousands of volumes at a time when the largest library in Christian Europe might have had a few hundred. Cordoba had street lighting, running water, and public baths when London and Paris were muddy villages. The contrast was stark and humiliating. Christian pilgrims traveling through Islamic Spain were stunned by what they saw: cities of marble and gardens, universities where Muslims, Christians, and Jews studied together, bookshops selling works on philosophy, mathematics, and medicine that didn't exist in Latin. It was everything Rome had been and Europe had lost. China during the Tang and Song dynasties was experiencing unprecedented prosperity and technological innovation. They invented gunpowder, the compass, and movable type printing centuries before Europe. India was a center of mathematical and astronomical learning. The Americas had complex civilizations with sophisticated architecture and social organization. The darkness, it turns out, was largely confined to Western Europe. The rest of the world was doing just fine. This raises an uncomfortable question. Why did Europe fall so far behind? Why did it take centuries for Western Europe to catch up? Part of it was the shock of Rome's collapse. Part of it was geography and the constant invasions from Vikings, Magyars, and Muslims. But part of it, the sinister part, was the choices made by European elites to reject learning, to suppress inquiry, and to maintain systems that kept the majority of people in ignorance and poverty. But nothing lasts forever, not even the Dark Ages. Around the year 1000, things began to change. Agricultural innovations like the heavy plow, the horse collar, and crop rotation increased food production. Populations began to grow. Trade routes reopened. New towns emerged. The climate warmed slightly, making farming more productive. Let's be specific about these changes because they're crucial to understanding how Europe climbed out of the darkness. The heavy plow, which could turn the thick, wet soils of northern Europe, allowed farmers to cultivate lands that had been essentially useless before. The three-field system of crop rotation meant that land was more productive and less likely to be exhausted. The horse collar, a seemingly simple innovation, allowed horses to pull plows without choking, making them far more efficient than oxen. These innovations sound mundane, but they triggered a revolution. More food meant more people meant more labor meant more surplus meant trade meant towns meant markets meant specialization meant craftsmen, merchants, and eventually a middle class. The population of Europe, which had collapsed from perhaps 30 million in Roman times to maybe 18 million by the year 600, began to grow again. By 1300, it would reach 70 million. More people meant more minds, more innovation, more cultural production. The Dark Ages were ending not because people suddenly got smarter, but because the material conditions for civilization were being restored. And critically, knowledge began to flow back into Europe. The Crusades, for all their brutality, opened channels of contact between Europe and the more advanced Islamic world. European scholars discovered Arabic translations of Greek texts they thought were lost forever. They encountered Arabic mathematics, astronomy, and medicine far superior to their own. Gerard of Cremona, a 12th-century Italian scholar, traveled to Toledo in Spain specifically to learn Arabic so he could translate texts. He personally translated over 80 works from Arabic to Latin, including Ptolemy's Almagest, Euclid's Elements, and numerous medical and mathematical treatises. One man, driven by hunger for knowledge, single-handedly recovered a significant portion of classical learning for Europe. Adelard of Bath traveled to the Islamic world in the early 12th century and returned with revolutionary ideas. He translated Euclid's Elements from Arabic, introduced Arabic numerals to Europe, and argued for the value of observation and experiment over blind acceptance of authority. His work laid groundwork for the scientific revolution that would come centuries later. Universities began to form. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, centers of learning where questions could be asked and debated. The rediscovery of Aristotle, filtered through Islamic commentaries, sparked an intellectual revolution. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas attempted to reconcile reason and faith, Greek philosophy and Christian theology. The Renaissance was dawning. The printing press would soon democratize knowledge. The age of exploration would expand horizons. The scientific revolution would unlock nature's secrets. The Enlightenment would champion reason and human rights. But none of this would have been possible without the hard lessons of the Dark Ages. Europe learned painfully what happens when civilizations collapse, when knowledge is lost, when inquiry is suppressed, when social systems prevent human potential from flourishing. So what's the real truth about Europe's lost centuries? The sinister truth. It's that the Dark Ages were both a tragedy and a warning. A tragedy because so much was lost that didn't need to be lost. So much human potential was wasted. So many lives were lived in unnecessary misery. And a warning because it showed how fragile civilization really is. How quickly order can collapse into chaos. How easily knowledge can be forgotten. How societies can deliberately choose ignorance over learning, superstition over reason, and rigid hierarchy over human flourishing. The Dark Ages teach us that progress is not inevitable, that civilizations can go backwards as well as forwards, that knowledge must be actively preserved and transmitted or it will be lost, that institutions must be maintained or they will crumble, that freedom and learning must be valued or they will disappear. We live in an age of unprecedented knowledge, unprecedented freedom, unprecedented prosperity. We have access to more information than any previous generation could have dreamed of. We have technologies that would seem like magic to our ancestors. We have opportunities for education and advancement that medieval peasants could never have imagined. But we also live in a time when misinformation spreads faster than truth, when expertise is dismissed and science is doubted, when libraries close for lack of funding, when education is seen as a privilege rather than a right, when societies polarize and institutions weaken. The Dark Ages remind us that none of what we have is guaranteed, that we must fight to preserve knowledge, to maintain institutions, to value learning, to keep the lights of civilization burning. Because if we don't, if we make the same mistakes our ancestors made, if we choose ignorance over knowledge, faith over reason, division over unity, we might just find ourselves stumbling back into darkness. And this time we'll have no excuse. This time we'll know better. The Dark Ages weren't just Europe's lost centuries. They were a glimpse into what humanity can become when it forgets the value of knowledge, when it stops asking questions, when it accepts that things cannot improve. We've spent the last 1,000 years climbing out of that darkness. Let's make sure we never fall back in. If this deep dive into history's darkest period has expanded your understanding of how civilizations rise and fall, make sure you're subscribed to Neural Battlefields, where we explore the conflicts, ideas, and turning points that shaped our world. Hit that like button if this documentary challenged your perspective on the Dark Ages, and share it with anyone who needs to understand that the progress we enjoy today is neither automatic nor guaranteed. What other historical mysteries should we investigate next? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember that knowledge is the only true weapon against the darkness. This is Neural Battlefield, signing off.